this idea of interdisciplinary problem solving already comes with a very particular notion of time, where the future is seen as as a problem we need to solve. So there is an issue, and if we work hard, then we can solve that problem. And it's a very, I would say it's kind of colonial idea of the future, where we say if we bring all our knowledge together, then we can really get a hold on the future.
That's the voice of Gert Biesta, and we're going to discuss his recent article called Turning the Arrow, Education After the Age of the Worldview. My name is Mario Veen, and you are listening to Challenging Time, where we challenge our notion of time in a time that is challenging us. Well, at least that's the title for now, we'll see. This is a reboot of the podcast formerly known as Live from Plato's Cave, and I'm still figuring out how I want to take this podcast forward. For example, there could be a nice intro tune here maybe. Anyway, one thing I already know is that I want to make shorter episodes. By shorter means under 1 hour. And I will keep these intros short as well. If I have more to say about an episode, I'll write it on my Substack, the link to which you can find in the description. You can subscribe to that Substack and it's like a newsletter. Or I'll record a separate episode, we'll see. Oh, and if you can read Dutch, you can order my book about Plato's Allegory of the Cave through the link in the description. I'm working on a book on climate and time now, hence the new podcast title. Okay, on to my conversation with Gert Biesta. Gert Biesta is Professor of Public Education in the Centre for Public Education and Pedagogy at Maynooth University, Ireland, and Visiting Professor of Education at the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. Until July 2025, he was Professor of Educational Theory and Pedagogy at the Moray House School of Education and Sport, University of Edinburgh. For a broader introduction of Gert's work, you can listen to episode 44, where we discussed his book World-Centered Education. Here's my conversation with Gert. Welcome, Gert.
Thank you.
Last time we spoke about your book World-Centered Education.
Yeah.
And then I saw you had a new article last April about my favorite essay of Martin Heidegger, The Age of the World Image, or The Age of the World Picture. So, of course, I had to invite you again. So, first of all, how did you come to this essay? Was it something that you've been familiar with for a long time?
I had known it for a long time, but it sort of disappeared in the background. And then a couple of years ago, in England, there was a big report on the future of religious education in schools. And the proposal was to rename it as Religious and Worldview Education. And something didn't feel right to me in that proposal. And then I thought, wait a minute, I have this essay somewhere from Heidegger who also uses this phrase worldview in English. And then I started to read it, and it was a revelation what was there in the essay. And it really helped me to begin to see what is, if you put it politely, what is odd about this whole idea of worldview. So that's how I came back to the essay, actually.
And what is odd about the idea of the worldview?
Actually, I think what I find really odd is this idea that people think that they are just free to have a view on the world or a view about the world, and that the world simply is there waiting for all these views. And I would even say, in a sense, that's quite arrogant if you put it in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And if you call it arrogant, you can say, then it's an attitude. And what I found really insightful in Heidegger's essay is that he says this idea of worldview is not a neutral category that we can apply across time, but it has a very specific historical origin. Um, and that means on the one hand, and that's a quick way to make the point, to say that you cannot say, oh, you have a Greek worldview, or there is a medieval worldview, or there is an Islamic worldview, because then you assume that worldview is just a neutral thing. And what he does very nicely is that he says this idea that there are human beings who view a world and that there is a world to be viewed is I call it in my own paper a configuration that emerged at a particular point in time, and that before that you cannot use this notion of worldview. And what I do in this paper is to ask, what if we see that the idea of worldview is of a particular period in time, and then ask, what if we go beyond this age of the worldview?
Yeah, I think if we translate it to a classroom setting, we're very used to thinking about, okay, there's the teacher, there's a class full of students, and each student has a perspective. Okay,
Yes.
maybe we're not doing mathematics, maybe we're doing history, or we're discussing societal issues, and maybe there are also different religious backgrounds. And then as a teacher, you're kind of teasing out different perspectives on the matter, and you as a teacher also have a perspective. And
Yeah.
then there are questions like, do you share your perspective or do you remain objective? And it really goes against this whole idea, right, of
Yeah.
individuals with perspectives that
Yes.
are kind of competing and trying to understand each other's
Yeah.
perspectives.
So perspectivism and this idea of having a perspective is another instance of this idea of worldview, you could say. And it plays out in classrooms. So on the one hand, it looks like, what is a democratic classroom? Well, where everyone can have their perspective, and then you share perspectives and you talk about it. It already puts the teacher in a difficult position often, because then teachers ask, should I share my perspective as well, or should I remain neutral? And there are countries that say teaching has to be neutral. That's currently, I think, the line that the Dutch government is taking. But again, you see it in a lot of discussions around citizenship education. The question, should the teacher be neutral or also have their own perspective? But at the same time, you see that what schools are doing, or what curricula are doing, is that they are still judging perspectives. So they have to say to their students in a mathematics lesson, look, it sounds very creative what you're saying, but this simply is not good mathematics. And in some areas, we find that easy to do. But when you go to history, for example, or geography or religion, then it becomes far more tricky to say that the school or the curriculum will give you the right perspective. So perspective is another example of this. And I know that there are people in education who actually do this positively, and they say education is all about giving students perspectives. But then I often think music is not a perspective, or gymnastics is not a perspective. So also, if you think that education is just about perspectives, you miss out on a lot of things that are not about perspective.
This is maybe a more technical question, but so the German word for that Heidegger uses in his title is Weltbild.
Yeah.
In Dutch, of course, we can translate this as build very
Yeah.
easily, but in English, you kind of have to choose between the one that I'm used to is the age of the world picture.
Yeah.
And you chose the translation, the age of the world image. Can you say why you made that choice?
Um, I have two different English translations on my desk, actually, and the one is the age of the world picture, and the other is the age of the world view. But I think that in that text, they do different translations of a key sentence in the essay, where Heidegger says, when the world becomes image or the world becomes picture. So there they translate it as image or as picture, what in German is Bild.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a nice sentence because he then suddenly says, the world becomes image and not the world itself. If maybe I can say a little of one step I take in my essay, because yeah, eventually the essay is quite critical about this idea of worldview. But I start by saying there is also something really important about this moment when the world becomes something to view by someone. I link it to the emergence of perspectival drawing, which was invented, I think, somewhere in the 16th
Yeah.
century, or it's ascribed to that point, where an artist figured out how you can draw in such a way that the drawing has perspective. And if you look at, for example, Egypt art, it has no perspective. A lot of medieval art has no perspective. And what is interesting about a drawing that has perspective is not just that it sort of gives the world as it really looks like, but it gives the world from a particular standpoint. So a perspectival drawing also defines a standpoint for the one who is looking at the world. And in the paper, I first of all say that's a real gain because it allows for individuals to be somewhere in relation to the world. And you can say that's modernization or perhaps even enlightenment, that it becomes that individuals are not interchangeable, but that it matters where they stand. But at the same time, you can say in this process where there is a world and a standpoint for the individual, the world begins to disappear because the world becomes picture or Bild or image. But you also then can begin to ask, but where actually does the individual stand? Is this a really possible standpoint, or is this maybe an illusion?
Mm.
So on the one hand, I say in the paper it's a game, but then I use two big words to say actually you begin to lose the world and you begin to lose the self in this
Mm.
configuration.
Yeah, I like this. It's also a Dutch expression, but also an English expression, having everything in the picture.
Yes.
So that we also get the idea that when the world is a picture, is an image, is a perspective, we can so the maybe the perspective painting is a good example because we can understand how to draw that. We can understand where perspectives come
Yeah.
from.
Yeah.
And then there's the idea that, oh, if we know this, then we have everything in the picture. We know everything that is
Yeah.
relevant. And for me, that's yeah, also the brilliance of Heidegger's, the way he explains it is that he starts talking about the world, but then actually he turns the camera around and he
Yeah.
talks about, yeah, but this means that we are becoming a subject. And
Yeah.
um, you don't, I think you don't use the word subjectification in your essay, right? Which is
Uh,
something your work has been a lot about.
yes. I may not use the word, but it's definitely a point I'm trying to make in the paper as well.
Mm.
So what's nice again is that Heidegger says in this age of the worldview, it's not just that the world becomes image, but the individual becomes subjective. So it is your subjective perspective, and someone else has another subjective perspective. And part of the trouble I encounter a lot when I introduced this word subjectification long ago is that a lot of people hear, oh, that is subjective. So he's talking about how can we make sure that all children have the opportunity for their own subjective point of view or their own subjective perspective. And that's precisely not what I try to do with this word subjectification. And there is a section in the paper in which I ask, how does the individual actually end up in the world? And in the age of the worldview, you can say the individual ends up as a world viewer, as someone who has a perspective, who has a view on the world. But the question that's never asked is how does the individual end up in that viewing position? That's already assumed in the whole framing. What I try to do again in this paper, but this is what I've been trying to do in other work as well, is to say to be a subject has something to do with your freedom. It's to discover maybe that as a human being you are not determined, but you are indeterminate. You're free. And that means that you can act and can make decisions, but it also means you have to act. Each morning when the alarm clock goes, you have to decide will you go out of bed or not. So there you already meet your indeterminateness. But freedom is not a matter of just choosing what you want to do. Because if you think that freedom is a matter of choice, then again you say, well, the world around me doesn't matter. Yeah, I have the right to choose. And if other people don't like it, well, too bad for them. This is a bit, I think, how Trump wakes up in the morning, where he thinks, yeah, I make my decisions and I don't care what that means for others.
Yeah, and Trump is a nice example because Trump is very good in constructing a picture of the world and how it is, and adjusting that picture accordingly, like getting people to say things, and this is how the world looks. So we have everything in the picture.
Yeah.
Then we can act and decide in this story, kind of.
Yeah. And there you can say this is precisely, it shows the problem of the age of the worldview, that anyone's perspective, in a sense, begins to become as valuable as anyone else's perspective. Now, with this subjectification, what I like in this word subject is that it also has the echo of being subjected to something. So for me, to be a subject is never just to do what you want to do, but it's actually to encounter what comes to you from the outside, another human being who asks you a question, a garden that needs attention, animals that need water and food. And in all these moments when questions come to you, questions that really matter, you suddenly realize, okay, I can say yes to this or no. I can look at the plants in my garden and I can see that they don't look very healthy. And then there is a question for me, what do I do with my freedom? Do I take care of these plants or not? Or I get a question from another human being, and again, do I engage with that question or not? So for me, in a sense, you encounter your freedom precisely when you are subjected to what comes to you from the outside. And for me, that's the heart of the idea of subjectification. And it goes against the neoliberal idea that we are all free, and free is just doing what you want to do or choosing what you want to choose. And then you can say that in those moments, you encounter the world differently, not as image, not as projection, not as your perspective, but as real, real also in such a way that the world is not just how you want it to be. But even more, you can say you meet the world as question or as demand, or Alfonso Linguis has a beautiful book on the imperative, where the world meets you. And that's a special moment because there the world appears in your life as real, not as image. But in that very moment, you also meet your own freedom and your own existence very differently than from this standpoint where you have a perspective. And that for me is the turn of the arrow, where the arrow doesn't go from me to the world, but where the arrow goes from the world to me. And I think that that insight, that the arrow can go in two very different directions, is important again for education.
Um, you name so you explicitly say this article is groundwork. So I'm sure
Yeah.
there's a lot more coming, and it for me it already inspires me to think in different directions. What can we do with this? But you do mention one specific example in education, which is the ecological crisis.
Yeah.
So maybe two questions. Why use this example? Because you use it at the end of your discussion of the worldview, and then you go into some criticism of this, which we can go into as well. But why did you choose this example, and why? Yeah, how does this turning the arrow make a difference in the ecological crisis?
Um, so I think the ecological crisis is one big case more than an example of what goes wrong if we think that our relationship with the world is one where we have a view on the world or a perspective on the world or even an opinion about the world. Because when we do that, we turn the world itself into some kind of silent object where we take the freedom to say what it is or what it's not. And in that relationship, the world itself has no voice. And then I think this is what has caused the ecological crisis, where we have just approached the world, the planet, the physical, the natural reality around us, as an object where we claim the right to do what we want to do. And it's precisely the arrow that goes from me to the world. And what I think we have forgotten there, and I say it all quickly with a big we, what some have forgotten or what had gone wrong there is that the world is not just anything we want it to be, but the world has its own integrity. And to meet the integrity of something is precisely to try to meet something else or someone else as subject that puts a question back to you. Can you, what is it, take into consideration the integrity of what you meet? And what has gone wrong and has caused a lot of ecological problems is that we constantly have not even considered the integrity, say, of ecosystems, which is a beautiful word because it says there is a system that hangs together that has its own integrity. But if you begin to push and pull too hard, it will fall apart because you interrupt its integrity. And therefore, I think the ecological crisis precisely shows what can go wrong if we think that the fundamental relationship is us having a view on the world.
Mm. Yeah, so this new series of podcasts is also for my research for a book I'm writing now about climate and time, and I really like this process with text, how it goes. So I know the Heidegger's essay quite well, and also had some thoughts about how to relate it to the ecological crisis. But then it's so great that I'm almost going to say that you share your perspective on it.
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
I would say not share your perspective, but that you rework it or that you do something with it in your essay and you focus it on education and you use this example of the ecological crisis. And then I go back to this text that I know so well, and for me, that clicked. I really like this process
mhm,
of going back and forth, and
yeah,
maybe it's also an example of what Mika Ball also calls the object speaks back, the world speaks back.
yeah,
So for me, it clicked that Heidegger writes somewhere that what happens. So when we turn the camera around, so to speak, we make the world in an image, but that means that the human subject, the individual, becomes kind of the measuring rod of
yeah,
everything. So it's only real if we can picture it, if we can represent it, if we can
yeah,
imagine it, if we
yeah,
can feel it. And where did this idea come from? That in this whole beautiful ecological planet of 4.5 billion years old, with all these incredible systems that we hardly understand, we've started saying, yeah, but only if we can understand it, it's real.
yeah. Yeah, and that when you put it like this, it's actually quite, well, let me use the word arrogant again. It's quite arrogant to say, oh yeah, it's only if we can understand it, then it's real. Um, it has something to do with bigger themes also of the denial of reality. Um, I know that there are a lot of concerns about, do we still know what truth is? But for me, there is another question: do we still know what real is? What are we still able to encounter things as real, and what does such an encounter mean?
Yeah. Okay, and then so after this step, you take Heidegger's essay, you use it in education or translate it to your context of
Mhm.
education. But then you also, so then the question is, of course, what do we do? And Heidegger sometimes, maybe Heidegger would say, uh, well, this is just the age we're living in. I'm
Yeah,
not, he would probably say it, I'm not even saying it's good or bad. It's just, this is, yeah, these are the cards we've been dealt. This
yeah,
is, we cannot change it. This is it. So I don't know what Heidegger would think about the title, like after the Age of the World picture.
yes, yeah. Yeah, I also don't know, and in a sense, I don't care. Uh, and yeah, there is something in Heidegger as well who would simply say, "Yeah, this is how it is," and but I wouldn't stop there. Um, I had an interesting conversation last Friday with a colleague in Germany who had read this paper, and he said, "I really like the paper, but I have one question: who turns the arrow?" And then I said, "That's cool. I'm going to meet Mario on Monday, and
Ah, nice. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Well, you did this turning is very central in your book, World-Centered Education, right?
yes,
Which
yeah,
also referred to Plato's allegory about, yeah,
yeah,
this turning.
yeah. So there's a lot of turning going on in education. So I do think, and that's also in world-centered education, the basic gesture of teaching is to try to turn your students' attention to where it's not going. That's why you need teaching, because yeah, we can all control our own attention, but the only thing we cannot do is to attend to what we do not know we can attend to. So there is already a very fundamental turning there. But yeah, in this paper, I also go to this didactic triangle or educational triangle that's used a lot in talking about education, where you can say education is always about three elements: a teacher, a student, and something. And the something can be the curriculum or the content or the world. Um, and partly this idea of turning the arrow emerged when I was thinking about this in terms of this didactic triangle, because this triangle not only has these three parties, but it also draws the arrows in very specific ways. So it says there is an arrow that goes from the teacher to the subject matter, because a good teacher, they need to know their subject matter. There is also an arrow that goes from the teacher to the student, and they would say that is the arrow of this instruction, where the teacher needs to instruct the student. And then there is the third arrow, and that goes from the student to the subject matter, and there they put the word learning. And if we accept that, then I would say we are in the age of the worldview, because we say the position of the student is one where they have a view on the world and can interpret the world and make sense of the world. But the world always ends up as object of learning or object of sense making. And to turning the arrow in this is to say, wait a minute, what if in education we draw an arrow in the opposite direction and say, the world is not an object of the student's learning, but the world is something or a subject that addresses the student, that knocks on the door of the student and says, hey, are you there? And how are you going to engage with what you find outside of yourself? And partly you can say this is, for example, curriculum. Do you think that curriculum is the subject matter that students need to get into their memory and then reproduce at a test? Or is the curriculum precisely the way in which we put the world on the table for our students, but the world as question or as demand or as imperative? So on the one hand, I think teachers can turn the arrow. It matters a lot in what you do with your students and how you think about subject matter, how the arrow is going. But I also think that when my colleague asked who turns the arrow, my first response was, why do we actually think that the arrow goes from us to the world? Why don't we begin with assuming that the arrow actually goes from the world to us? And in that sense, you can begin to ask, how have we become to assume that this is the natural way in which we are in the world?
Right. Yeah, the way you explain it now, it also makes me realize I've been looking at the triangle. There's the relationship between the world and the student, and between the
Mhm.
teacher and the student, but also between the teacher and the world or the
Yeah,
subject matter. And how you said it is that so our image of education is also that the teacher uh, preferably maybe even creates the subject matter
yeah,
uh, because we want to know that we give the students this subject matter, or it can be a book or an assignment or something, so that we know in advance that what they will learn from it, right? So
yeah,
this is
exactly.
isn't
Yeah,
this another instance of how we think we have everything in the picture,
yeah,
and we know that if we have them do that, we know what they will learn, and these are the skills that they need to learn. And I'm thinking about, because I remember in the last podcast I asked you, we were talking about do we always need an educator, like a person
mhm,
in education? And I was then asking about this example of, can, for instance, a forest be a teacher? That you say, well, in this case, you still have, I guess, an educator that says, okay, we're going to a forest. You're going to walk around, I don't know, in silence
yeah,
for 1 hour and observe. And then we come together and then we discuss your experiences or
yeah.
something.
Um, so yeah, there are two things where I want to respond to this question. Do we need a teacher? Um, I wrote another paper, so maybe we need another hour in the future, in which I introduce Biesta's razor, analog and Occam's razor. And I say Biesta's razor is the principle that education is only needed for those things that cannot happen without education. And I think a lot of things can happen without education. If you want to learn, get a job at McDonald's or IKEA or at a coding company, you will learn an awful lot. But of course, there are things you will never learn there, like the questions that are difficult or that go against the company's policy. Or so I think it's very helpful to be precise about when it's needed. And of course, you can walk in a forest and wonderful things can happen. Um, but of course, to walk in a forest where there is a teacher who says, maybe it's a good idea if today we take that path, or maybe it's a good idea if we take half an hour and just sit still and listen. Not in order then to predetermine what should come out of that, but it allows to interrupt where maybe the attention of the student would quickly go. But then it also has to do with your other point that if we think that the relationship between the teacher and the subject matter is one where the teacher already is the expert in the subject matter, and that's what we're constantly being told. Teachers, first of all, need to have a knowledge of their subject before they can teach. But the risk then, as you said, is that teaching becomes no more than a trick, where the teacher said, my only job is to get the student where I already have been. And I think that that's also a very poor way of understanding what can go on in teaching. When I teach, I'm very strict in what I want my students to do. So I'll say, here is a book, and you have to read the whole book. And then we're going to do something interesting, because then I'm curious not to hear back what my encounter with that book has been, but I'm interested to hear back what your encounter with that book has been. And if we think that the teacher already knows where the student should end up, we make that into a very superficial dynamics.
So would you be able to teach a course if I told you, okay, tomorrow we need a substitute teacher about this course? You can do it however you want, but it's a topic that you don't know anything about. Would you be able to do that? Or would you say, no, that's not good education? I would familiarize myself with the subject.
So if I get an invitation like that, I would always say yes. I would always be up for it. But of course, it then matters exactly what we're doing there. So if the lesson is about how to fly a Boeing 777, that's probably not a good idea. So it's not that this is unlimited. But I would say my expertise as a teacher is to open up the world for students in an educationally significant way. And educationally significant always with the proviso, I don't need to do what they can already do themselves. So I need to look for things that maybe they are not able to do themselves. And there I would, with some care, even have the Boeing 777 there to say, okay, today I do not know how to fly such a plane, and I'm happy to work hard as a teacher to do a lot of work there. But my main job is to help you students to begin to figure out everything that is required to fly a plane and fly it well. And then I would say, as a pedagogue, in such a way that you don't end up just being a machine inside a machine, but that you always fly a plane with responsibility. That for me is to say, yeah, you have qualification and socialization, but it only becomes something educationally significant if we don't forget that our students are human beings who, even if they are qualified and socialized, need to keep thinking about what they are doing. And with that question, I would be happy and of course also very nervous to step in any classroom.
Mm.
And that's not to say in an arrogant way knowledge doesn't matter, but it would be to say my job is not to just get my students to the point that I already know. I'm happy to do the hard work also to improve my knowledge of what we're doing. But my job is far more interesting as a teacher.
Well, I guess that's good news for teachers now because one of the things I spend a lot of time on is to think about uh, climate education or education in the climate crisis, where in another institution where where I worked, there was a research, and we found that actually the students there really wanted to learn about that, but the teachers were kind of the bottleneck.
Mm-hmm.
And in other studies, we also see, but also my personal experience is that a lot of teachers feel like they're not qualified to do that because they don't
Yeah,
know enough. For instance, I don't know about climate science enough, or don't know about this enough. And then also there's the added factor that none of us know what's going to happen, because what's going to happen is going to depend a lot on, well, things that we don't have in the picture, and also on political decisions and other kinds of decisions that are being taken. So you're teaching, Ginny Servan Miklos wrote a book about this pedagogies of collapse. Like, what do you, and one of the things that she tells students is the future that you've been told is going to happen, where Elon Musk saves the world. It's not going to happen. And then we
yeah,
start from there. And of course, we could say the same thing about AI, right? Which is also a
yeah,
development that many teachers feels like, okay, I'm just familiar with ChatGPT, and now there's all this other stuff already. How can I give education about
yeah,
this?
yeah. Um, and again, I think this is the significance also what's in Heidegger's essay, that as long as you think that the world is just object for our knowledge and understanding, then the teacher always needs to be ahead of the student. But if you say, no, actually, we meet the world also as question, as appeal, there, in a sense, as teacher and student, you are in the same relationship with that question. So the whole question of what educational expertise is shifts there. This is not, in case listeners would wonder, this is not an argument for sort of flat learning communities where we say, oh, we are all just learners. Because for me, then we can no longer say what is special about the work of the teacher. And I think one thing that is really the responsibility of the teacher is to constantly try to see where the attention of students is going, and what other possibilities for attention there might be. That is teacherly work. This is also not an argument for interdisciplinary problem solving, which I see a lot in education, where people say we need to think in an interdisciplinary way, not a disciplinary way, because we need to be able to solve problems, and for that we need to have many different perspectives again. And again, what worries me about those kind of framings of, what I think are present themselves as progressive pedagogies is that they assume that the world is a problem that needs to be solved. And again, I find a bit of arrogance in that encounter with the world, where we say if we just bring all the knowledge of all the disciplines together, then we can solve the world as problem. But the world is so much more than just a problem that needs to be solved. So there are some subtle differences in, I think, what I'm keen to say or keen to try to bring in the attention of the educational discussion.
Mm. I'm
Uh, mhm.
thinking now because this is the first episode of the restart of the podcast, and I told myself I want to keep it under an hour.
Okay.
And I have two questions. Okay, maybe I will ask first the question about this podcast, and then we see how much time we have to maybe go into Heidegger's essay a little bit.
Yeah.
So the title of this podcast, Challenging Time, is meant to convey that we live in a challenging time, uh, and um, in this challenging time, we need to challenge time.
Yeah.
So I wonder about um, how you see the role of time. I'm
Yeah.
just going to try it to make it
Yeah.
to. That's the question. How do you see
Yeah.
the role of time?
Again, it's a fantastic question for yeah, a number of reasons. Um, I think what I just said about this idea of interdisciplinary problem solving already comes with a very particular notion of time, um, where the future is seen as yeah, again, as a problem we need to solve. So there is an issue, and if we work hard, then we can solve that problem. Um, and it's a very, yeah, I would say it's kind of colonial idea of the future, where we say if we bring all our knowledge together, then we can really get a hold on the future. So it's a very, I often see this in talk about the future, where it says we do not know what the future will be like, so but we need to be prepared for anything that may happen. I guess that's how Columbus set out when he said, yeah, we do not know what we're going, but we need to have all the skills to engage with it. But that very ambition again to say we will get it in our hands. We'll get we'll get everything in the picture is a colonial mindset towards the future. Um, but there are also, yeah, other questions about time. I once wrote an essay called How Much Time Does Education Need? Because one of the worries I have is that a lot of education is also caught up in chronological ideas of time. And there are two keywords there, development and growth. And I see a lot of talk in education that says about, oh, what we're doing is to support the development of children and young people. In some countries like the Netherlands, it's a tremendously influential educational vocabulary, or this idea that through education students can grow. Um, and for me, one question is always missing there, namely, which growth is relevant and which growth is problematic, which development is going to help and which development is going to hinder. And to ask that question, which you can ask very concretely. You can say to a student, okay, it looks like you're developing, but now we need to talk about, is this a direction in which you should be going? That for me is an interruption of time, where suddenly, if you encounter such a question, you are pulled into your existence. And yeah, I again would say those interruptions of chronological time, they are moments of subjectification, where suddenly this question is there someone there who exists rather than simply develops chronologically? And there you can say education doesn't need time, doesn't need to say how can we make sure that a child develops from A to B. Education constantly needs to interrupt this kind of chronological development and asks the existential question, is there someone there who exists who wants to take a responsibility for their development? So those for me are interesting reflections on time and education, that there is a very chronological notion of education that misses the whole point of human existence as subject, I would say.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
Okay, Thanks very much for the opportunity.